Support for the Q&A with A.P.C. is provided by the Massa Corporation. For 55 years, the Massa Corporation has provided companies with a complete line of printing solutions, from custom labels to contract packaging services, as well as packaging equipment and supplies. Proudly serving Virginia and its neighbors since 1961. Online at massacorp.com. This is Andrew Paul Cronin, and you're listening to the Q&A with A.P.C., the show that features conversations with artists, cultural figures, policymakers, performers, and other innovators living in Virginia. Episode 24, JoAnn Falletta. For the last 26 years, my guest, JoAnn Falletta, has been the music director and principal conductor of the Virginia Symphony Orchestra. She began studying and playing classical guitar at age 7, and while growing up in New York City and attending concerts and performances, she became fascinated by conductors and conducting. JoAnn Falletta received her undergraduate degree from Mannes College of Music in New York and earned her master's and doctorate degrees from the Juilliard School. Prior to taking over the Virginia Symphony Orchestra, she conducted the Long Beach Symphony Orchestra, the Milwaukee Symphony Orchestra, the Denver Chamber Orchestra, and the Women's Philharmonic, among others. Nominated for 10 and winner of 2 Grammy Awards, she has been profiled by the New York Times and the Washington Post and has been featured on CBS Sunday Morning, Charlie Rose, and on the cover of the magazine Time for Kids. This episode of the Q&A with A.P.C. was recorded at the Virginia Symphony Orchestra headquarters in downtown Norfolk. For more information on the Virginia Symphony Orchestra, visit virginiasymphony.org. You were born and raised in New York?
Yes, I was born in New York City. I grew up in the borough of New York City called Queens, which is not nearly as glamorous as people think of New York City. I mean, it wasn't Manhattan, but it was one of the boroughs. So we were in New York City all the time, and I feel very lucky growing up there because it was, and I think it still is, such a cultural center. So my sister and I were exposed to music and dance and opera at an early age, just because it was all around us.
How did your family end up living in New York?
Well, my parents were children of immigrants from Italy, and they came over at the turn of the last century, their parents, and had their families here in the United States. So they were first-generation Americans living in Little Italy in New York City. But when my parents got married, they wanted to move to a place where they could raise children in a different environment. So Queens is a lovely place to live. I mean, it's a kind of a bedroom community to New York City, so a lot of families, a lot of nice restaurants, a very good feeling of ethnic diversity. We grew up in the middle of a very interesting Greek neighborhood, which Astoria still is, with wonderful Greek neighbors and Greek cookies and Greek food and Greek customs. So it was a fun place to grow up.
You have a sister. You mentioned you have a sister. Is she older than you or younger than you?
She's my younger sister. She's 2 years younger than I am, and we both studied music when we were young. My parents wanted us to have it in our lives. They were both music lovers, especially my father, who really always wanted to study music. But as you can imagine, as the child of Italian immigrants, that wasn't an easy thing to hope for, because there was almost no money and no opportunities, and my grandparents didn't even speak English, so it was. But it's something he loved, and he decided that Luann and I would have music lessons, and we did, and we loved it. She played piano mostly. I started on classical guitar, and But she went into math. She's a very, very brilliant little sister, and she went into math and is a mathematician. And worked for
In
a
terms
while.
of like a teaching capacity or engineering?
Well, she
or?
she worked as an engineer for Bell Labs for many years, and then decided she wanted to spend like the second phase of her life as a math teacher. So she teaches calculus in high school, and she loves it. She loves it, and I have so much respect for her because I know teaching in high school, especially, is not an easy thing, as you know, as
That
a
is true,
teacher yourself.
absolutely.
But she's dedicated to it, and just as brilliant in math. So I'm very proud of her. But she still plays piano and loves music.
She's in New York?
She's in New Jersey.
New Jersey. Your father was musical. You mentioned that. He wanted to play the clarinet. He was
He
a big
did.
Benny Goodman fan.
Absolutely, like many people, I guess, of his generation, he loved the big band. He loved clarinet most of all. He just loved Artie Shaw and Benny Goodman. He just loved that instrument. So he was thrilled when he saw that I was really enjoying music and very supportive of it. Frankly, when I think my parents realized that I wanted to become a professional musician, they were worried, because I think parents today still are, because I talk to a lot of parents who feel the same way. How would one pursue a career in music? How do you know what to do? And was it a good career? Was it a career where you could earn a living? And it didn't seem so to them. So my father always wanted me to be a lawyer. And at a certain point, he realized, okay, he said, you go ahead and you go because you love music, and let's see what happens. And I'm so grateful for both him and my mother's support, or thinking that there's just something that she has to do.
Every Sunday growing up, you had music day in your house. Describe what a Sunday would look like and sound like in your home growing up.
Well, we have, as most Italians, we always had our big meal about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and it was always pasta. just happy things, and of course we'd have aunts and uncles always with us, and cousins, and since my sister and I played, we'd always play, and they'd love to sing, and we would play Italian songs or big band songs or folk songs, and everyone would sing along, and it was very happy.
And when you say
times.
play, you mean we are creating the music ourselves, not necessarily
Yes,
on a...
yes. No, because my sister would accompany anything, and I would either play I would either play guitar, or sometimes I played mandolin, especially with the Italian songs. They love to hear the mandolin, and my sister still jokes about my trilling the mandolin in her ear and driving her crazy while we were playing together. But I thought everybody did that. I thought everybody made music at home, and it just seemed so natural to have that wonderful experience, and it brought all of us close together.
What was your father's profession?
He worked in the ladies' garment industry all of his life, and my mother was an accountant, and they came to know the world of music. I mean, they came to know what a musician's life was like, and I think they were always a little confused by it. I mean, and I know of many of my colleagues who come from families who aren't musician families, and I ask them about their parents, and they say, well, they don't really know what I'm doing, but they're happy that I'm happy. And I think it's the same thing with my parents. They were happy that I was happy.
The uncertainty of being able to make a living, as you mentioned,
Yeah.
is very much on their mind. Living in New York, you and your family went to Carnegie Hall and many other concert venues. Talk about your memories as a child attending these concerts and performances.
I remembered how much I loved them. I was always dazzled by the orchestra especially, because I'd like to watch them. I'd come in early and I'd see how they were warming up, and everybody was playing the difficult parts and not listening to anybody else, but just practicing. And then when the conductor came out, everything fell into place, and it was perfect. I mean, to my ears, everything was perfect, and it was so inspiring to see them dedicated to excellence. Everyone was leaning forward, and you could tell they were thinking of nothing but playing this music in the best way possible. And I would feel this sense of just a kind of lightness, a kind of feeling of being ennobled by this music. I couldn't even put it into words. I think the idea that somehow this music made me feel in touch with something very special. So I started to talk to my parents about the age of 9 or 10, saying, that's what I want to do. I want to be in the middle of that. I want to be the person who helps people do that. They didn't know, but we continued to go to concerts, and finally, I was studying piano. I was studying harmony and theory and classical guitar, and I went to audition at Mannes at the age of 18 because they had a good guitar program, a very good classical guitar program, and I told them I got accepted, and I told them I want to study conducting. And they said, well, at that point, there weren't many women conducting, and they were very kind. They said, it's difficult because you have really no role models. It's going to be a hard thing to do because it's a very male-oriented profession. But I persisted. I was only 18, and I said, well, I want to try it. And they said, okay. And I became a double major, and very grateful to Mannes, the Mannes College of Music, because they were willing to take a chance.
We jumped ahead a little bit there. You started training in classical guitar
That's right.
at age 7, is that right?
Yes, on my 7th birthday, because my father loved the guitar as well. And he bought me for my birthday, very unexpectedly, this beautiful little guitar. And he had made arrangements for my teacher to come the next day. So I got my first lesson when I was 7, and I loved it. I loved everything about that guitar. I loved the way the fragrance of the wood. I loved the way the strings felt when I touched them. The varnish on the instrument. I mean, I just was in love with it. I remember even just playing the open strings, which is how we start, playing the open strings.
Sure.
I thought that was fantastic, just to hear those 6 notes. I mean, it was like amazing. So I loved the guitar, and I still love it so much. It seemed to me a very personal, very beautiful, very subtle and nuanced instrument, and that was where my journey began. I think in retrospect now, looking back at my childhood, I was a very shy child, and maybe my parents thought that this would be some way of my expressing myself, and it was. It became really the focus of my life. That little guitar, and it helped me come to know who I was, without even knowing that was happening, but come to understand myself and come to understand what music means to people, and it was very precious. It sounds like you're a musician and you played an instrument.
I do play the guitar.
Oh, so you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I played a little bit in high school and put it down, and then I picked it up 3 years ago because work was stressful and I felt like I needed some sort of outlet. I still had a guitar, and I play every night. Sometimes only 5-10 minutes, sometimes 2 hours.
But you go into another world.
Yes.
It's so beautiful. You see, and that's what happens when people listen to music. That's why I feel it's so good for all of us, because we come into the concert hall, and oftentimes people like we are. We're stressed.
Yes.
We sit down in the seat and we're thinking about, maybe I shouldn't have come. I have so much work at home. I could have been working now, or I don't know if I'm going to like this program. And all of a sudden, something starts to happen to us. We're listening to the music. We go someplace else. We kind of find something out about ourselves wordlessly. And when we leave at 10 o'clock, it's as if we've been changed. Our whole outlook on the world has been changed. Music is so powerful. It does something to our psyche.
It does. There's sort of an otherworldliness to it, I suppose, and there's a lightness that it provides, and also an introspection, and also a motivator sometimes, which I think classical music is unique in the sense that it can really drive you up emotionally and calm you down, all within just a few measures of itself.
It's true.
You taught your father to play guitar, is that true?
I did, because he loved the guitar as well, and I think when I had been playing for 2 or 3 years, he said, okay, how about if you teach me now? And I loved that. I mean, we played duets together, and again, in retrospect, I realized that maybe my father was actually helping me have the experience of teaching someone, which is a great thing to learn. How do you teach someone to play an instrument? Well, I had to figure it out, and of course he was my father, and he was very patient with me. But I realized he was thinking on several levels. He was learning to play the guitar, which he really loved, and I was learning how to begin to learn about the art of teaching and how special it was to be able to express something to another person to help them understand.
Is the piano the best, or what is the best instrument to prepare you for becoming a conductor?
People differ. I mean, we've had conductors, of course, who play everything from trumpet to percussion to guitar, but probably one of the most valuable trainings is piano, because you can play so many notes at once, and it's spread out in a concrete way in front of you. But it's also very valuable to know how to play a string instrument, because a bowed string instrument like violin or cello, because so much of the orchestra is made up of those instruments, and the sound of an orchestra is often determined by how the strings play. So again, conductors who don't play those instruments try and find out as much as they can about them. I think it's not necessary to know how to finger all the notes on a bassoon, but you have to know what the instrument is capable of. You have to know where it sounds best, what the challenges of the instruments are, and really know how it fits in with an orchestra, with all the instruments.
Talk about the importance of seeing Sarah Caldwell conduct the New York Philharmonic when you were in your teens.
It was very important to me. I think she was the first. She was the first woman I ever saw conducting, and it was a very big and exciting thing because the New York Philharmonic had invited a woman, which I think they might have decades before with Nadia Boulanger. I'm not sure if she actually conducted the New York Philharmonic, but this was a very big deal, and it was also one that was greeted with a lot of skepticism too. And I was old enough to realize that I could feel that
In the press,
in the maybe in the audience,
Yes.
like, well, you think that this woman can really conduct and that sort of thing. And even among the players, I could tell by some of the body language that they weren't really sure that this was a serious thing. The orchestras was still at that point largely male. It was changing, but conductors hadn't changed very much. So I remember that, and I remember feeling saddened by that here's this woman who was obviously such a great musician, and I figured that she must have been also feeling a little bit of the sense of having to prove herself, that people were not sure she could do it.
you could feel it in the ether almost.
You
sort
could.
of, yeah.
You really could. It was just the beginning of that happening.
You talked about getting your undergraduate degree in classical guitar from Mannes College of Music in New York City, and you got your master's and your doctorate degrees in conducting from the Juilliard School. The acceptance rate at Juilliard is in the single digits, and they take less than 10% of all applicants. What was the admission or application process like for you? Did you have to audition? What was that like?
You had to audition. You applied, and I guess they went through all of their applications and then invited maybe 20 people or 25 people to audition, and it was in front of the orchestra. And it was a very tough audition because they'd chosen repertoire that was very difficult, and you knew that was going to happen. You had to.
They choose what you play.
They chose repertoire that was very difficult, and the orchestra was told to deliberately make mistakes because you were supposed to be able to catch the mistakes, and it was a little tricky because you didn't know if it was an accidental mistake or was it a mistake that you should stop and say something, and it was a very nervous-making experience. But everyone who takes auditions will say the same thing. It's really hard. But I was thrilled when they asked me to be a member of the class, and I think there were 4 or 5 of us at that time, and it was very intense. It was a very intense place to study, very, very competitive, and Juilliard encouraged competition because they felt that only in that kind of environment would you know what the real world was going to be like, and you had to be strong enough for that. And if you weren't strong enough for that, then you would find out right away and leave. It was like they tried to sift people through. It was very intense, but it was wonderful. I learned so much, just so much by watching and listening, and it is an extraordinary school.
When you were a student in New York, you played guitar, lute, and the mandolin for the Metropolitan Opera and the New York Philharmonic. How did you get involved with those 2 groups?
Well, they needed people who could play certain parts. I mean, those are not generally instruments that are in the orchestra, of course, guitar, mandolin, and lute. So occasionally when they have a need for them, like some of the Verdi operas needed a mandolin, and there was a piece by Handel that needed a lute, they would call the school. They'd call Juilliard and say, do you know anybody who plays the lute or plays the mandolin? And they would send me. And it was so interesting to be in the pit in Metropolitan Opera or to be on stage with Court Mazur and the New York Philharmonic, terrified, absolutely terrified. And to be in the middle of an orchestra. Of course, for me, it was also doubly interesting because I was trying to see how orchestras reacted to conductors, too, and what worked and what didn't work. And so I learned a great deal. But that's a tough environment, too, those New York Philharmonic and the Met.
Sure, and still are.
Yes.
Did you ever have a New York accent?
I did, and it comes back to me sometimes. If I go back to New York and I'm talking to people, it will come back. Or when I used to talk to my mom, it would come back right away. I think I lost some of it, not all of it, in traveling so much.
Someone in the New York Times wrote, and I just want you to react to what they said about conducting. She said, a conductor should possess the strength of a dancer, the facial expressiveness of an actor, the organizational ability of an executive, the interpersonal skills of a psychologist, the inspirational capacity of a religious leader, and, of course, a musicianship so sensitive and so compelling that 100 other musicians will accept his or her reading of a given work as their own. Does that about describe what you have to do to become a conductor?
It's true. And I probably should add to that. No one is actually qualified to be a conductor. I mean, there's so many skills required that you can only hope that you keep growing and keep developing these skills. But yes, it's enormous, enormous requirements. And some people are better at some things than others. But what you said is true. I mean, you need to have aspects of all of that.
So the strength of a dancer.
Physical strength, I think, because it requires tremendous physical strength. I mean, I'm not aware of it now because I do it every day of my life, so it seems so natural to me. But standing, for sometimes 5-6 hours a day, constantly moving, and constantly being aware of everything that's happening. Every movement you make has a meaning, and it may not be so clear to the public, but it is clear to the musicians, how you want them to play, what kind of style, what kind of articulation, what dynamics, what approach to the phrase. All of that you're incorporating, so your body is constantly in motion. And a lot of conductors have to be careful with rotator cuff problems, shoulder problems, or lower back problems. For me, it's actually exercise. I love to do it because if I'm in motion, I feel like my body is feeling good. But I find sometimes, like if I've got a month off in the summer, 3 weeks off, when I start conducting again, I realize, this is hard work because I lose a little bit of muscle strength in those few weeks.
The organization of an executive.
Because you have to be so organized. It's even in the week we have, like in Virginia Symphony, we had a week, we had about 10 hours of rehearsal to prepare for this concert. Now, the concert takes 2 hours to play, so that's not a lot of rehearsal because you've got to polish everything. So you have to have a plan always in your mind for every second on the podium. What should I be doing now? And sometimes that plan gets stretched in one direction or another direction. You've got to come back to it. You've got to be flexible enough to say, okay, I used a little more time on the third movement, but now I'm going to use a little less time on the fourth movement. So constantly you're organizing how you're going to do it. And this is in the strict confines of rehearsals that cannot go overtime. So you've got to really always be monitoring yourself as you go along. When I first started, I'd draw up a plan. I'd actually write it down. I'm starting at 7:30, and by 8 o'clock, I have to be finished the first movement. And so I'd be checking, I'm not, and I'd know I'd be running behind. And
this is live on stage you're talking about.
Yes, in rehearsals, right.
Yes.
Now I have a better internal timing sense when I sense that, I need to let go of this and come back to it at another point so I can go on. But you need to be very, very organized.
The interpersonal skills of a psychologist.
That is the hardest thing to learn because that's something you never address in school. But you're dealing with an organization of really gifted people. Very gifted people. I mean, they're the people who are in these orchestras are the top 1% of musicians in the world, and they have very healthy, developed egos. And I'm saying that in a good sense. They know what they know about music, and they want to do their best, and they want to have somebody help create that situation. And they're sensitive, and everyone is different. There are some people who don't mind at all if you tell them, no, please don't slow down there. Oh yeah, okay, I won't. But there are other people who are much more sensitive about being told that they're flat or sharp, so you get to know your players and how to deal with them. Some people love to be challenged. They just love to be asked to play louder or more soloistically. They love that. Some people really like to be not pointed out in rehearsal at all. So you're always dealing with how to talk to gifted people. And I make this point to sometimes leaders in other fields, leaders in who are not conductors, that when you're dealing with a very gifted team, you're very lucky. But it's a tremendous responsibility because you have to be able to enable all of them to be as good as they are, to use their skills. And you have to be able to to put yourself last and put them first. It's not like some people think, oh, you're the conductor, you're at the top of the pyramid. They have to do whatever you say. So no, you should really think of the pyramid as being inverted. You're at the bottom of the pyramid, and you have to support all these people who are very gifted and very capable, but need to be allowed to do their thing. So having a gifted team is sometimes the greatest challenge of how to utilize that.
You've conducted many orchestras over your career, including the Milwaukee Symphony Orchestra, the Denver Chamber Orchestra, the Long Beach Symphony Orchestra, the Women's Philharmonic in San Francisco, among others. When you conduct different orchestras, do you approach each in the same way, or do you change certain things about yourself based on who the musicians are?
I think I do change things because I react to them as they are, as a group. I mean, and every group has its own dynamics. So while I may be looking for the same thing in Tchaikovsky Fifth, the same architecture, the same scope, the same way of putting the piece together, I may speak to them slightly differently or ask for things in a different way. Even as sometimes it depends too on how much rehearsal you have. When I go to Europe, I usually have much more rehearsal than I have in the United States, and I can work slower. I can take more time, and they're used to that because they have more time. When you're in the United States, you have very limited rehearsal time. That's expensive. So you learn to work very fast and very practically, because you've got to get through it.
You brought up other countries. Let's take Tchaikovsky's Fifth. If you were to, and you are currently conducting that starting tomorrow night, if you were to have Tchaikovsky's Fifth with the Virginia Symphony Orchestra, and then you were to go to Ireland, and you were the conductor, again conducting Tchaikovsky's Fifth, do different orchestras in different countries sound different, even with you as the conductor?
They do, and it's not only in different countries. Even in the United States, orchestras sound different because of who the personnel is. I mean, you may have a horn section that is very kind of bottom heavy in terms of their approach to tempo and takes a lot of time, and it's beautiful. You may have a string section that's very nimble and can play at any tempo. So yes, it is different, and to me, that's the great thing because again, I come with a concept of the piece and an interpretation. I come with my plan, but then it's always malleable. It's always changed. I mean, I'm sure it's like teaching a class too. You may say, okay, this is how I'm going to teach it. But then some young person says something interesting and you go in that direction, or exactly like that for a conductor. Someone plays something very beautifully and takes a little more time, and that influences how someone else plays. So for me, the greatest joy is to let the orchestra be themselves, to let them show who they are, and to help that fit into your interpretation. It's not like you're throwing yours out the window, but you're saying, okay, here's the structure, but how can I be flexible in these ways to let them be individuals? And that's what's wonderful.
When you are conducting the Virginia Symphony Orchestra on a Friday night in Virginia Beach, and then the next night in Newport News, and then the next night in Norfolk, the same piece with you as the conductor, the same musicians in the same place, each night sounds different?
It does, partly because the halls are different. The hall to me is like an instrument. When you're inside a hall, you're inside an instrument. So that what sounds very, very resonant in Newport News will sound a little bit more blended in Sandler. So you're taking advantage of the qualities of the hall. But it is different. And of course, music is very fluid. If anyone's ever seen a Broadway play, like on two successive nights, or a play on two, things are different. If someone takes a little longer to say something, someone forgets a line, someone says something louder, or something happens, something falls off a table, anything can happen. And that's the great thing about live performance of anything, that it's irreplicable. It's one time only, so it's fun that way.
Do you play with the nuances of the venues in terms of, let's say, the Sandler Center has a certain sound, so you would bring the horn section up to more of fortissimo based on Virginia Beach, and I know when I go to Chrysler Hall, I'm going to have to change the arc of the sound a little bit differently? I mean, is it that?
Yes, and my teacher always said this to me when I was studying with him, and I didn't understand it then, because I'd say to him, Maestro, how fast should I take this? He says, it depends on the hall. And I was always frustrated because I wanted to know exactly, like quarter note equals
Yes.
62. But he was right. It depends on the sound you're getting back. If you can relax a little bit, or if you need to move through things, if you need to bring out individual players, the woodwinds need to come out more, you need to keep the strings down a little bit. All of that is part of the hall. So it is different. And the players get used to it too.
You became music director of the Virginia Symphony Orchestra in 1991 and celebrated your 25th anniversary with the orchestra last year. Congratulations.
Thank you.
When you move to a new city and begin working with that city's orchestra, what are the challenges for you?
To really learn about the city, because I think the orchestra, of course, doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists as the main cultural organization of the city, or even of the region. And you have to know the people well. You have to know the history of the orchestra. You have to know what they like, what they don't like, what they might like, that they don't know about. So with Virginia, it was interesting to begin to introduce some maybe less traditional music in concerts very slowly and very carefully, and have people like that and have people respond to that, to open the door in many ways to a new type of music. And in this region, it was been very fascinating for me that we are a region made up of 6 or 7 little cities. So each city has its own personality. Williamsburg has their thing, and Virginia Beach thinks of themselves in one way, and Norfolk in another. So to understand the psyche of the audiences and the corporations and the people who are helping us as donors becomes a large part of the job.
When does it become your orchestra? And I don't know if that's the best phrase for it, because I suppose it is our orchestra. But when do you start feeling like you have a handle on the musicians in the city? Does it happen immediately? Does it change from one city to the next in your experience? When do you feel like it becomes sort of your orchestra?
I guess it's a 2-part answer. In some ways, when you guest conduct, you spend only a week with the orchestra, and yet at the concert you feel like you've made the orchestra your own in that week, and they have responded to you in a unique way, and you to them in a unique way. But that's transitory. And then they'll go on the next week and work with someone else. So for me to have your own orchestra and have a long-term impact, I think I've found that it takes probably about 5 years before you start to realize that you're all thinking in a like way, that you're breathing together, you're feeling the music in a certain way together, and that's very special when they can understand you without you saying anything, and you know what they need and they want without them saying anything. But that takes about 5 years to really feel like, yes, I can get up and just conduct through this piece. They'll be able to follow almost instinctively of where we're going.
And we've developed a shorthand after a shortened amount of time.
Exactly.
I read an interview with conductor James Levine, who said the conductor's job is 80 to 90% accomplished in rehearsals. What specific things do you seek to accomplish in rehearsals?
Most of the work is done in rehearsals. That's where you formulate the interpretation, and you go over a lot of things again and again. You may read through something for 2 minutes and say nothing, and then get onto a passage where you stay for 5 minutes on that passage. So it really is working and taking things apart, putting them back together, trying again to make sense of it. There is some speaking where you might try and explain something, or they may ask a question. There are a lot of questions that come up in rehearsals. So it's not like we're reading through the music, although I usually start a rehearsal with having us just play something together to kind of warm up. But a lot of it is stopping and starting and discussing and putting things together. I sometimes try and explain to people who have never seen an orchestra rehearsal that it's a little bit like a play. When the director is there, the director comes with a concept, but then in the rehearsals, things change. The one actor might be able to make a very grand physical entrance, so you take advantage of that, and you write that into your kind of concept of the piece. The director also has to be very flexible about the talents that he has. With play is the equivalent of a score of music where the words are the same, but depending on who's saying them, they could feel very different. The same thing with an orchestra.
Sure, and I suppose sometimes in rehearsal someone will play something a certain way that you didn't necessarily anticipate for them to say, and you could say something like, "Oh, I like that. I like how you did that,"
Exactly.
and sort of write that in.
Write that in, and or even make a point to the orchestra, like I was saying, listen, the clarinetist played that passage in such a convincing way. When you have it, listen to how they play it, so that a lot of times orchestras are just learning from each other. So you're right. I mean, you might change a concept of something depending on how that player likes to play it.
Which goes back into what you were saying earlier about having to know the specific instruments and what their capacity is physically as musicians, but also the instruments themselves to know what to sort of bring up or bring down. How do you approach learning a new score? What specific things do you do? Do you read it? Do you play other interpretations of it? Do you take notes on it? What do you do? Is this at home?
It's always at home or wherever I am at the time, but quietly when there's no sound, and I just look at the score and hear it in my head. And I like to, and my first go at the score is to look at it in the large sense, so that I'm looking at it first as a big scale thing. So for instance, if it was a symphony, I'd say, okay, here is a symphony. It's 50 minutes long. It has 4 movements, like the Tchaikovsky 5. It has 4 movements, 50 minutes long. Okay, how do the movements, first of all, relate to each other? Okay, fast movement, then the slow movement, then a little lighthearted movement, then the allegro. So you're getting a sense of the architecture moving inwards. And you keep moving inwards. Then you take one movement at a time. You do the same thing. Okay, here's the movement. How many parts are there really? Usually 3 big parts. Okay, 3 parts. How do they relate to each other? And you start to sort of sketch out the building of it. So I always move from large to small. So the very last steps, I'm looking at note to note, like the notes that the oboe is playing in that little melodic fragment. But I don't start with that, and I don't really start reading left to right because I don't know how I don't know where it's going to end. I'd like to see the whole cathedral first, and then start studying the details so that I know the shape of it, and that helps me because in a way, music is a challenging art form in that people only hear it, people in the concert hall, but they have to understand the architecture somehow, so that when the piece ends, there's a feeling of, yeah, that felt right. I mean, you've not done it well if the piece ends and people are not sure if it's over or not.
Sure.
So like, or it's sometimes you go to a very contemporary play and it ends and you're saying, well, what was that about? What happened at the end?
Yes.
And you're kind of confused. Maybe that's the point in some cases.
Talk about the psychology of conducting, its authoritative nature, and how that element of the profession has played out for you as a woman.
That's a very good question because the conductor is in charge. I mean, I think that's what the mystique of it, and why we have people like Toscanini and Herbert von Karajan, or Toscanini was such a terrible tyrant and abusive as well, or Herbert von Karajan, who probably never spoke to a musician. They were the ultimate dictator. And that has certainly changed. But the conductor is still the one who is leading the group and makes the decisions. And a large part of that is just practicality. If you have a group of 85 people or 100 people, you can't discuss things. Or you could spend a year on the piece. You just can't discuss. You get a lot of feeling from body language or how people are playing, but you can't really have full-fledged discussions where you say, what do you think of that tempo? Well, I like it, but I think it's too fast. No, I don't know, but how about that section? Well, that's a little too slow. You can imagine. So the accepted thing is that the conductor is going to make these decisions. And to have that authority, you need to feel, I think, for myself, but first of all, that you're there for the right reason. You're on the podium to help this wonderful thing happen. So you have to be there for the right reason, that you believe so much in music and in this orchestra and this organization that you want to enable the greatest level of artistry possible. And enable is more the thing. You're not going to force anything. You're going to enable the musicians to be able to do it. You're going to establish a landscape where they can be great artists. That's what it is. You have to create that environment where excellence can flourish. And so that's the job of the conductor. That's authority. But with authority comes a big responsibility. And I think my teacher helped me realize that, because I had a typical, I guess, upbringing where it wasn't always considered polite to demand that people do things or insist that people do things, or or even yell at people. We didn't do that. But he said to me, you have to find a way of having authority that's you're comfortable with. But you have to have authority, or else the group will not be comfortable. You have to have authority for the right reason, because you believe in the music and you believe in the musicians, and you have to be able to express it because they need that. They need a frame. They don't need a tyrant, but they need a frame so that they can feel comfortable with. It's as if there are no boundaries, if there are no things
Some
together,
parameters,
they won't ever feel comfortable. So they need, and they accept that. They accept it. And of course, if they feel that it's musically makes sense, they're very comfortable. So, I mean, you have to really know what you're doing musically and always study for that reason.
Has it been more difficult for you to achieve that authority as a woman in your profession?
Yes, I think it was difficult because one of my teachers, George Mester, was very gifted at this because he had never taught a woman before. And he became aware that I used different language than my 3 or 4 colleagues who were all young men. We were all there together, but they would be able to say something like, start at letter C. And I would say the same thing. Could we please start at letter C? Now, it doesn't seem like it's a bad thing to say, but there was a certain way that women sometimes have, and I'm still aware of it, of undermining what we're asking for and sending a subtle signal that I'm not sure, or I really shouldn't be asking for this, but when one of my young male colleagues would correct the oboe, they'd look right at the oboe and say, oboe, you're late. And I would look at my score instead, looking down and say, oboe, I think that at measure 3 you might be late. Well, that's not the same thing. It's a way of softening things, but not in a way that orchestras feel comfortable. Now, I don't think they would feel comfortable if either a man or woman would bellow at the oboe and say, you idiot, you're late. No, that's not good either. But to be able to state what needs to be stated for the purpose of the music is something you have to learn.
Sometimes in professional sports, there appears to be a feeling from the players that the coach or the person drawing up the plays and calling the shots is so out of touch and not physically able to perform the maneuvers they are asking the players to do that the athletes don't take the coach or the coaching seriously. Does this kind of thing happen when conducting an orchestra?
Yes, because I think it goes back to even the idea of the director of the play. Like the director of the play may be telling them, you're not convincing in that. You have to convince us. Well, the actor might say, well, you do it, show me. So there is that. But yeah, I mean, do musicians always agree with what the conductor asks them to do? Oh, absolutely not. I mean, absolutely not, because they might like it slower or faster and whatever, but they'll do their best to fit into the interpretation. And, sometimes at the beginning of a week, the musicians are not quite sure, does this work? I don't know. I used to play it faster. I liked it faster. And then somehow over the 4 or 5 rehearsals, they say, it makes sense this way in this interpretation. The same way we might see Hamlet with, 3 or 4 different Hamlets and say initially that when we're watching the second one, oh, I like the other guy much better.
Right.
But then all of a sudden you realize, oh, he has a very different way of presenting this. And that's really what a conductor brings is a different set of possibilities that might initially feel strange, but musicians are willing to try them.
And are those conversations held between the musicians, or are those spoken directly to you, those sort of thoughts?
Sometimes, I mean, I always consider myself lucky if musicians come up and say anything like, or they may say a question like, do you think we really have to play that fast at such and such a spot? And I'll say, how come? Well, why are you asking that? Well, if I could play a little slower, I could just get a certain color on my English horn. If I just had a little more time, I said, you know what? You're right, George. Let me give you a little more time. So sometimes if they're willing to share from their perspective what an actor might say to a director, can you give me a little more time before the door opens there, because I'd like to hesitate.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
That's how their input really colors things.
Do you have any pre or post show rituals?
Well, some little rituals. For instance, on the day of a concert, I never eat before a concert, so I always eat lunch, and I always take a nap. So I mean, and that I feel like I have to do that. After lunch, I'll take a little nap, and then because then I find that as the concert time draws near, I start to get a feeling of adrenaline, a little anxiety. I mean, and I think that's good. I mean, I think if I were just stumbled on the stage and said, "Oh, it's a concert," that would be bad.
Yes.
But you start as you're getting closer to performance time, you start to experience a feeling of adrenaline anxiety. But with anxiety comes excitement too. So, and I try and manage it so that I make it tipped more towards the excitement side than the dread side. It's amazing how many musicians suffer from that. I mean, we all do on some level. And I'm sure actors do the same thing, dancers do the same thing. There's a sense of really wanting to get out there on the stage and also at the same time dreading it.
Are there nights where you left the stage and felt that you had reached a place that you hadn't achieved before?
Sometimes. I mean, a couple of months ago, we did the Verdi Requiem. And I've done that piece before, and it's a very powerful piece, a very moving piece. But there was something about this performance that I said to the chorus afterwards when I was speaking to them, that I didn't feel like it was a performance. I almost felt like we were at something sacred. It was like a communion of souls. We were all together celebrating the fear of death, the hope of an afterlife, not knowing, but we were actually experiencing that together. We weren't performing it for the audience. We were just doing it. We were living it on the stage. And sometimes an experience like that, you never forget for the rest of your life.
You've won 2 Grammy Awards and been nominated for 10. Have you attended the award ceremony? And if so, what is the day like leading up to the evening's award show?
I did attend the first time I was nominated, actually for a piece by Ken Fuchs, we're doing his work today. I went to the award ceremony, and it was surreal. It was totally surreal because you have to arrive at like 9 o'clock in the morning, and then you're at the facility the whole day. So you have to come in serious, glamorous evening clothes at 9 in the morning and wear them the entire day.
Wow.
A lot of the awards are given during the day. The ones that you see at night aren't the very, very important awards, and they're given in the performance. And the performance was overwhelming, and it was the loudest performance I was ever at in my life. I was sitting there in the classical section with everyone, and I happened to be sitting next to a Buddhist monk who was there. He had been nominated for world music, for singing, for chanting.
Yes.
And I could tell that he was not prepared for the volume of
the
sound.
sensory overload. Yes.
Oh my! Yeah, the lights, but the volume. It was amazing to be in something like that, and it was astonishing. But it was totally fun, but
Yes.
very loud.
Where did they seat the orchestra and the world music people? Are you up in the balcony somewhere?
We were in a section where it didn't seem to be the really rock music people. It was the world music, the folk music, the classical music, and so it was kind of nice because there was a very good mix there. But you could tell that for all of us, this level of sound was not something we were used to.
Overall, how are the arts doing in America right now?
I have to answer in 2 ways. I mean, the arts have never been stronger. Our artists, our painters, our dancers, our musicians are at the top level in the world. It's astonishing the way they're trained, the kind of imagination that they have, their willingness to think outside the box, the kind of ethnic diversity that we enjoy in our country is a big influence on us. So I think the people who make art are just the strongest and most fearless people, and our musicians I see are playing at an extraordinarily high level. On the other hand, we always feel, and maybe artists have always felt this way, that somehow our art is endangered, that maybe people won't want it anymore, maybe people won't see the need for it. And yet we can't imagine that. We can't imagine living without art. We can't imagine someone not being moved by a concert or not being excited by a dance performance or going to a play and learning something about themselves. This happens to people every single moment. I mean, I can see, because I see with a lot of young people who study music or study painting or study dancing or sing in choirs, how much it enriches them as human beings. I mean, they learn they learn what's important. They learn what beauty is. They learn what quality is, and they protect that.
Mm-hmm.
And the best thing of all is that they become open-minded to other people, because all the arts are not cut and dried. It's not black or white, or the arts are always offering other alternatives. It can be done this way, or it can be, this book can mean that, this poem can mean this, but it could also mean this. And they come to understand that not everything is so clear, and it's in this ambiguity that we really find what the world means. And because they're comfortable with ambiguity, they learn to accept other people who are not like them. The arts bring us together, so all of a sudden we're creating a world where people reach out to other people through the arts. If we didn't have the arts, I think those divisions would be so deep.
I want to talk about some of the upcoming performances for the Virginia Symphony Orchestra. Over the next few months, you have Itzhak Perlman coming,
Yes.
the great violinist, Peter and the Wolf, which was always a favorite of mine.
Yeah.
That oboe is just so haunting, isn't it? Music of Star Wars coming up, Roots, the British Isles. Later that month, Mother's Fairy Tale Afternoon.
We've got a lot coming up. And as you see, I mean, the Virginia Symphony is just an amazing organization, amazing orchestra, because they can go from playing Star Wars to playing Peter and the Wolf, for kids, for an audience of kids, to playing Berlioz's Requiem with 400 people on the stage, and a chorus from Washington, a chorus from here, and they can play anything, and they offer these kinds of options for people of any kind of taste.
Right. You're a published poet, right?
Well, I am. I don't put myself in that kind of a published poet. I mean, I write poems for myself, really, but they're all about music. I really started writing them as kind of a diary, because I'd never written a diary, and I thought, this performance was so special. Let me just write down what it meant.
Yes.
And that's how I started writing poems.
There are several of your poems on your website, JoAnnFalletta.com. Would you mind reading one of your poems? I've printed one out. I've chosen To the Audience. If you don't mind, you can
okay.
say no. Is that all right?
Yeah. Oh, I'm glad you chose this one, because I sometimes think that the audience feels that they're not important. They're just sitting there. They're not doing anything. And I've always tried to tell them that they are such a large part of the performance. They don't know how vital they are to us. So I wrote this trying to get them to understand that. To the audience. The rehearsals are not enough. We need witnesses, faces turned up like sunflowers, expectant ears wide open, sharp eyes following our fingers as they race over strings and keys. Tell us that it means something to you, this music, these years of practice and difficulties and frustrations. Watch us as even the shyest among us become timid exhibitionists, wanting to be under your closest scrutiny. We long to tell you something, how important this is to us. How astonishing is this music under our fingers. Look at us as we play. We need witnesses to our music. We need witnesses to our lives to tell us that they matter, to tell us that even with our flawed gifts, with our insecurities, with all that we can never do, we can still give you a little bit of ecstasy.
That was To the Audience, written by my guest, JoAnn Falletta. Thanks for reading that.
Thank you.
You fly a lot in airplanes. Do you have any advice or tips to make airline travel more enjoyable?
Well, I don't know. I'm not the biggest fan of airline travel, but I do travel a lot. I always bring my scores with me, and for me, it's like a little capsule of time where I have my phone turned off, I don't have my computer on, so I'm alone with my music, and I really like that. I mean, that's the nicest thing for me. So I would suggest for anyone, just make sure you have some music that you love with you. It's a good time to block out the news and not worry about that for 2 or 3 hours when you're on the plane. I think that helps me a lot. That helps me think of it as a kind of private space where I can just concentrate on something beautiful.
Maestro, Dr. Falletta, what do I call you?
Well, everyone calls me JoAnn. That's what I'm very comfortable with. I mean, the maestro always seemed a little no one ever knew whether it was supposed to be maestro or maestra, and some people are real sticklers for that, and there is no correct answer, because the term maestro in Italian really means teacher, and it always applied to a music conductor. But the word maestra means, when the Italians say it, means an elementary school teacher rather than a conductor, because they would never imagine that a woman would ever be a conductor. So the terms don't really translate. But I think people have always called me JoAnn.
JoAnn Falletta, thank you so much for coming on the show. It means a lot to me. Thank you for everything that you've done for Virginia and for music.
Well, thank you, Andrew. This was a delight. I have to say, I don't think I've ever had an interview that was so interesting and so probing and so absolutely knowledgeable. I mean, it was really just fantastic to talk to you about music, and which I know you love too. So thank you for this.
Thanks, JoAnn.
Thank you.
This is Andrew Paul Cronin, and you've been listening to the Q&A with A.P.C. To hear archived episodes, go to soundcloud.com/QAAPC or subscribe to the show on iTunes. For exclusive content, including upcoming shows, behind-the-scenes pictures, and more, follow the show on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at QAAPC. The executive producer of the Q&A with A.P.C. is Ben Riley. The music was arranged by Soup.